We will have two notorious speakers today, first Dan and then Charles. Charles is, he's very well known for his work on, not just on the work of Deleuze and Guattari, but also on the work between Deleuze and Guattari. So on the work that is needed to maintain the work. Part of it is the Deleuze Seminar archives. And Dan is also, you can trace that back in your Google Scholar. Dan is also, at least for me, the main reference that I give to people when they want to start working with Deleuze. You will find many of my students there. So we hope you enjoy both Dan and Charles, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stavros. Well, since archiving is one of the themes of the conference, Charles and I wanted to do a joint presentation today because we wanted to use our time, in essence, to do a kind of launch of this project we've been working on called the Deleuze Seminars, which is a digital humanities archival project that we're co-directing. The aim of the project is to transcribe and translate into English all the seminar lectures that Deleuze gave at the University of Paris 8 between the years 1970, when Deleuze started teaching at the university, and 1987, when he retired. So it's a 17-year period, and then to make them available freely online. So this is a screenshot of the homepage, which is housed at my university at Purdue, and there's the URL. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the project for a few minutes, and then hand it over to Charlie. In a sense, the story begins in late 1969 when Deleuze, who was then teaching in Lyon, was invited by Michel Foucault to join the Department of Philosophy at a newly established campus of the University of Paris that was officially called the Experimental University Center at Vincennes. This is a picture of the campus just after its construction in the Bois de Vincennes, just outside of Paris. Deleuze accepted, but he had just undergone a serious operation, or a thoracoplasty, which left him with a single lung and respiratory problems for the rest of his life. He spent a full year recovering from the operation at his family home in the Limousin region of France, and was not able to start teaching at Vincennes until the next year. Deleuze later said that the title of 1,000 Plateaus was inspired in part by the granite plateau called Mille Vaches, which is the picture on the right, that he could see from the windows of his house during his recovery. So as you know, Mille Vaches means 1,000 cows. So an alternate title maybe that you can keep in mind. Once he arrived at Vincennes, Deleuze started teaching a weekly seminar in a small classroom on Tuesday mornings that usually lasted around 3 hours. Deleuze was already fairly well known and had a reputation as a compelling teacher, so his classroom was inevitably overcrowded since Deleuze refused to teach in a large lecture hall. It's interesting to compare these two images of Deleuze in his classroom at Vincennes on the left, and Roland Barthes in a lecture hall at the Collège de France, that's his inaugural lecture, both in 1977. Needless to say, the ambiance of the two rooms is very different. This seminar essentially became Deleuze's life for the next 17 years, until he retired in 1987. As you know, he didn't like traveling, he didn't like conferences, so he would give his seminar, spend the next week reading, writing, and preparing for his next seminar. That was his life, which he admitted at several points was very uninteresting, at least on the outside. As he liked to say, he did internal voyages in intensity. The seminar became a kind of laboratory for Deleuze, a workshop where he could experiment with his production of concepts. Every book Deleuze wrote from that point on was initially developed in these seminar classes. There are several things, I think, that made Deleuze's move to Vincennes significant for him, perhaps as significant as his encounter with Guattari, which also happened in 1979. One was simply the colleagues that Deleuze found there. The professors that Foucault brought together at Vincennes today reads like a who's who of French philosophy. Here's a list of the classes that were proposed for the fall semester of 1968, which didn't happen because it took a while to get things going. But it includes courses by Michel Foucault, Jacques Rancière, François Châtelet, Alain Badiou, Étienne Balibar, Michel Serres, Jeanette Colombel, and Judith Miller, who is Jacques Lacan's daughter, and Jean-François Lyotard would arrive the next year. A second factor was no doubt the political ambiance of the Vincennes campus, which was created as a response to the events of May 1968, and to some degree was an embodiment of the leftist and counterculture ethos of the 1960s. It was a time of protests, sit-ins, and demonstrations, and it is no surprise that the entirety of the political philosophy of capitalism and schizophrenia was written while Deleuze was at Vincennes. In the mid-70s, Alain Badiou, on the left, led a brigade of Maoists at Vincennes, who would often burst into Deleuze's classroom and prevent him from finishing his seminar, since at the time, Badiou considered Deleuze to be, quote, an enemy of the people. In the end, this political turbulence was the downfall of Vincennes. In August 1980, the facilities were bulldozed literally in the middle of the night one night, by the conservative government, and the faculty was forcibly transferred to the Paris suburb of Saint-Denis, where it remains to this day. Michel Serres, on the right, who left Vincennes after his first year for the Sorbonne, just as Foucault would leave for the Collège de France, had rather dark memories of that time. This is a quote from him. "I had the impression," he said, "of being plunged into the same atmosphere of intellectual terrorism as the one imposed by the Stalinists when I was a student at the Rue d'Ulm," which means the École Normale Supérieure. Deleuze's feelings about Vincennes, however, were the exact opposite. In every way, pedagogically, politically, institutionally, personally, Deleuze seems to have found Vincennes to be the perfect milieu for his work. Above all, I think it was the ambiance of the classroom that seems to have motivated his fidelity to Vincennes. When he arrived at Vincennes, Deleuze said that he found himself, this is a quote, before a completely new kind of audience that was no longer made up of students. "I spoke before a mixed audience, young painters, people undergoing psychiatric treatment, musicians, addicts, young architects. It was like an echo chamber, a feedback loop in which an idea reappeared after going, as it were, through various filters. It was there that I realized how much philosophy needs not only a philosophical understanding through concepts, but also a non-philosophical understanding rooted in percepts and affects. You need both." Later in his life, Deleuze said, quote, "When I visited other schools after Vincennes, it seemed like I was traveling back in time, of landing back in the middle of the 19th century." I have a pet theory that Deleuze deliberately put this line, "it shits and fucks," in the opening paragraph of Anti-Oedipus to ensure that he would never receive an invitation to move to a place like the Sorbonne or the Collège de France, because it's not a line that enamors you with the powers that be. When it comes to archiving, however, Deleuze's seminars pose a particular challenge. When Deleuze arrived at his course on Tuesday mornings, he never had a written text with him, but at best a small piece of paper with minimal notes, since he essentially knew what he wanted to say by heart. A close friend of Deleuze recalled that, quote, "Jules would start to work on his courses on Sunday morning, sometimes Saturday. He thought about what he was going to say for 3 days before he left for his course. It was almost like a physical preparation, like someone training for a race." Deleuze himself said that he tried to present his courses in the same way Bob Dylan organizes a song. The fact that Deleuze never used a written text in his seminars, however, is significant. It is the reason Deleuze did not leave behind a written archive, as did, for instance, Foucault or Derrida, whose seminar texts, as you know, are also in the process of being published. Now, everything Deleuze did and said at these seminar performances might have been lost to us had not students early on started to make recordings of the sessions. Every week, Deleuze was surrounded by a bevy of battery-powered cassette recorders, with students constantly sneaking forward to turn over or replace their cassettes. By the way, that young man on the right, I believe, is François Zurabichvili, who became one of Deleuze's earliest and best interpreters. I only noticed that, after I'd found this image online and put it in my PowerPoint. Presumably, Deleuze recognized that the recordings might well be available to posterity, though to my knowledge, he never said anything about that. Luckily for us, one of the students who recorded Deleuze's seminars was a Japanese student named Hidenobu Suzuki, and that's him on the left. Suzuki arrived in Paris from Tokyo in 1974 in order to study literature at the Sorbonne, and he started attending Deleuze's seminars in 1979. Seeing all the cassette recorders in the room, Suzuki started bringing his own, which of course happened to be the latest Sony model from Japan. Suzuki would attend and record every one of Deleuze's seminars for the next 8 years, between 1979 and 1987, always seated like this, right next to Deleuze. Suzuki later said, "Going to his seminars became my passion." It is largely because of the efforts of Suzuki that we now have a kind of archive of Deleuze's seminars. 4 years after Deleuze's death in 1999, the French National Library, recognizing the importance of Deleuze's work as part of France's national patrimony, decided to establish an audio archive of the seminars, which was based entirely on the recordings of Suzuki, which were converted into digital files and are now available online at the library's Gallica site, which you see here. I'm not sure, frankly, how it all came about, if Suzuki offered his cassettes to the BNF or if someone at the BNF knew about the recordings and requested them, but the archive now includes 273 cassettes of 180 separate lectures comprising 413 hours of recordings. 2 years later, in 2001, a group of preeminent French scholars, which included Alain Badiou, no longer the enemy of the people, and was headed by Mario Burkhalter, formed a nonprofit organization that began to produce written transcriptions of the recordings in the BNF archive. These are now available at a website at Paris 8, hosted at Paris 8, called The Voice of Gilles Deleuze Online, which can be accessed at the URL at the bottom. The transcriptions were done by graduate students in philosophy at Paris 8, over 200 of them. There is required internships, and this is one of the ways you could fill your internship requirement. And in the end, the project took 14 years to complete. And this is where we entered the picture. At a certain point around 2011, the transcriptions at Paris 8 slowed to a trickle and then largely stopped, as often happens with such long-term projects. I personally was anxious to read Deleuze's seminar on Foucault, which they had not even started on. So I applied for and received funding from my own university, Purdue University, to help finish the transcriptions, which were completed around 2014 by Annabelle Dufourcq, who now teaches at Radboud University here in the Netherlands, but she was unable to attend the conference. It was then that a number of colleagues came up with the idea that it would be a service to the academic community to have these now completed transcriptions translated into English. We applied for funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities in the US, and after 2 failed applications, you all know this story, we were finally successful on a third, which we received in 2015. So our project to translate Deleuze's seminars has now been going on for 9 years, and we expect the translations to be completed in the next year or so. I confess I'm still amazed that the United States government is actually funding a project to translate anything by Deleuze. But this brings us back to the webpage for the Deleuze seminars. Before turning things over to Charlie, I just want to do 2 more things. First, to encourage you to use the site, I want to argue to you that Deleuze's seminar lectures are in some way as important as his books, perhaps even more so, and I want to quickly give you 2 examples of why I think this is the case. My favorite example comes from a 1987 seminar session on Leibniz, examining the notion of human freedom that's been nicknamed the tavern. Leibniz asked a simple question in one of his texts: how can I freely decide whether to stay at home and continue working or to go out to a tavern and meet some friends? It's a question of freedom, decision. Leibniz's response is that it can never be a matter of simply assessing these 2 options by some sort of decision procedure as if they were weights in a balance, because each of these options is in fact made up of an infinite multiplicity of minute perceptions and inclinations that are in constant flux and that constantly fold my psyche or my soul in different directions. The camaraderie with friends at the tavern, the clink of the glasses, the taste of the beer, but also my solitude at home, the tap of my fingers on the computer, my engagement with my work. What we call a decision is in reality really an integration of the manifold of these minute inclinations into a decisive inclination. As Leibniz famously says, we incline without necessitating. So at some point I'd say, to hell with it, I'm going to the tavern. It's a fantastic lecture and a long one. The transcript runs to almost 30 single-spaced pages. I was blown away when I read it for the first time. It first appeared on in Web Deleuze. But I asked myself, why doesn't this analysis appear in Deleuze's book on Leibniz, The Fold, which I had already read and which was the result of these seminars? So I went back to the book and looked at it, and I discovered, well, Deleuze does, in fact, talk about, but the entire 30-page seminar is reduced to this. Less than a paragraph, in fact, exactly 7 sentences. I confess it annoyed me somewhat, because even though I think I know Deleuze's work fairly well, there is no way I could possibly myself have deduced the rich details of that 3-hour lecture from these 7 sentences. And this is something you realize fairly quickly in reading Deleuze. The Fold, as a book, is really just a highly abridged and condensed version of his seminar lectures. And for me, there are many passages in the book that would have remained incomprehensible to me had I not had the occasion and opportunity to read these seminar lectures. Here's a slightly different example. This is from 1984 during the cinema seminar that led to the publication of the book, The Time Image. Deleuze devoted a full 4 sessions to an analysis of the intensive philosophy of time found in Plotinus, which he contrasts with Plato's conception of time as a measure of extensive movements. So it's a fascinating analysis of extensive and intensive understandings of time. Here again, it's an extraordinary analysis done over 4 sessions, and I asked myself, where does this material appear in the Time Image book? So I again did a search for the word Plotinus in the 2 volumes of the cinema books, and I discovered exactly where the analysis is. Nowhere. This analysis appears nowhere in the cinema books. In other words, this analysis of Plotinus' concept of time, which amounts to around 80 single-space pages, is available only in the seminar lectures. So I could give many more examples, but the point, is, as I've said, is that Deleuze books are really just kind of abridged, condensed versions of everything he was doing in these seminars, and there are lots of analyses that, in fact, never wound up in his books. So at the moment, our site contains about 2 million words, which would be about 20 to 25 volumes if they were in print. So there's much new philosophical material there for Deleuze scholars to make use of. Second, and finally, for me, I want to end with a plea for help from you. As I've mentioned, because of Suzuki, a Japanese student, we have recordings of almost all of Deleuze's seminars between 1989 and 1987. Before that, however, between 1970, when he started teaching, and 1979, when Suzuki started attending, we have relatively little, and what we do have is largely due to the efforts of another one of Deleuze's students, the guitarist Richard Pinhas. Shortly after Deleuze's death, Pinhas created a wonderful website called Web Deleuze, which no doubt many of you are familiar with. Pinhas posted transcriptions of seminar sessions that he himself had attended and recorded, but there are still enormous gaps because Pinhas, had a day job and was often on tour with his band Helden. So we, if we can, would like to retrieve as many recordings as possible from this somewhat lost decade of the 1970s. These were the years when Deleuze and Guattari were writing Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, and if you sometimes find aspects of those books obscure, imagine what it would be like if you could read the 10 years of seminar discussions that went into their production. But the clock is ticking, and we need your help, frankly. Students who attended Deleuze's first course at Vincennes in 1970 when they were 25 would now be approaching 80 years old. And in fact, I have an image in my head of a box of their Deleuze cassettes sitting on a shelf in a closet or a garage somewhere, like this, that may soon be thrown away by one of their children because they don't know what's on them, and moreover, they couldn't even listen to them if they wanted to because they don't own a cassette player. So we'd like to find those cassettes before they disappear. But it's not easy. We've asked everyone we know if they have acquaintances who might have attended Deleuze's seminars. We've posted appeals on social media, though 80-year-olds are generally not a demographic spending tons of time surfing the web. Something we haven't done, which only occurred to me as I was writing this, is to go to the Paris 8 archives to find the list of students who were actually registered for Deleuze's courses and try to locate them and contact them that way. So if anyone wants to take that on, we'd be indebted to you. But generally, I suspect that in the end, it may only be through somewhat random word-of-mouth connections that we're going to find any of these new recordings. So this is a genuine appeal if you have any ideas. I recently learned from a colleague that there is a new name for what I'm talking about and asking of you today. In the information age, it's called a data rescue. We're trying to rescue data. And we've created a page on our website with that title. In fact, the colleague who told this to me was the head of the digital research repository at my university, Purdue University. But he's also a Deadhead, which means he was a fan of the American rock group, the Grateful Dead. So Deadheads are not unlike Swifties in their devotion, even though the music is very different. But he was involved in a data rescue of the bootleg recordings of every single concert the Grateful Dead gave, a heroic task that ultimately included over 17,000 items that you can now listen to on this website if you're a Deadhead and want to listen to every single concert the Grateful Dead ever gave. So I figure that if Deadheads can retrieve and compile 17,000 bootleg recordings, we Deleuze heads can follow their lead and somehow manage to locate the roughly 200 or so seminars that are missing. So, Deleuze heads of the world unite. So if you know of anyone who might have recordings, or if you have any suggestions on how to find these people and their recordings, come talk to Charlie and I during the conference, or check out this page, which tells you how to contact us, and in fact gives information at the bottom of this page of all of the seminar recordings that were missing. So really, this is one of the reasons we wanted to officially launch the Deleuze Seminars here in Delft before such an impressive group of researchers and scholars who are interested in Deleuze. So quite serious plea if you have any ideas. So with that, I will turn things over to Charlie, who will discuss in more detail some of the challenges we faced in archiving, transcribing, and translating Deleuze's seminars. Thanks.
Hey, Dan. Okay. So to continue from Dan's presentation, before I do, I just want to thank the organizers for a gracious welcome here in Delft and the university's facilities, and also all the hard work that you put into your different papers and presentations. I want to turn to our abstract in the program and note that the title of our joint talk was inspired by the conference's call for papers, specifically the focus on 3 socio-techno-environmental regimes of madness: intelligence, instituting, and archiving. That is, by addressing the pragmatics of how intelligence happens, who institutes it, and through which technologies it is archived. My immediate question upon reading the conference's call for papers was, and is, how such instituting and archiving practices might be associated with regimes of madness. And I immediately looked at the way that Deleuze delineated within a specific context of the late 19th and 20th century 2 regimes of signs and corresponding madness: paranoid and passional regimes, the former as the supposedly infinite ensemble of signs referring to other signs and to an even greater signifier, the latter as a vast circular formation in perpetual extension, with these poles varying in speed and territories from one regime to another. In thinking about the different steps of the Deleuze Seminars project in terms of causing such circulation of signs, I would try to consider how specific archival practices might develop in relation to aspects of the poles that Deleuze outlined. The danger, of course, exists of freezing the signifier too firmly within a kind of paranoid pole that is locking down too fully eventual access to feedback and possibilities of revision. On the other hand, the intention of this project would be more toward the passional, toward causing the circle of meaning to grow toward intelligence and new lines of creativity. In fact, while I cannot fully envisage what the passional perpetual extension would be in this regard, I can better understand our efforts in these archival practices as tending towards a possible third regime, and in between that might be conceptualized as the material regime, or, to borrow a term from the call for papers, the material discursive. In this way, our work constitutes a process of creation as mediators, and as Deleuze describes this, these archival practices enable the formation of mediators in series, providing a very real and material sense to the notion of community. To enter this material discursive regime, Dan has already addressed some of the aspects of this project, and I'll consider a number of practical concerns at the heart of the site's development. That is, the challenges that we have faced, which can be summed up concisely with the phrase, the devil is in the transcripts. To explain this pithy aphorism, I must pursue the successive steps we have followed, and Dan's alluded to the grant-getting process between 2011 and 2024. And I arrived at the Deleuze Seminars project in 2019 with prior contributions in hand. Translations solicited by Tim Murphy in the late 1990s on behalf of the musician and Deleuze scholar Richard Pinnas. And my work contributed translations to Pinnas's site, Web Deleuze, with the translations of the 5 1980 Leibniz sessions. However, in beginning work for the Deleuze Seminars project, I came to understand how the devil is in the transcripts would emerge in different ways, leading to what I can call various manifestations of archive madness. A learning curve was necessary to undo my fundamental naivete about the tools with which we were working, namely, my assumption that what had already been posted on other platforms was accurate. As this proved not to be the case, our challenges were to recognize an array of errors that crept into seemingly straightforward process, all obviously requiring correction. So let me review some points already mentioned by Dan in order to give credit where credit certainly is due. That is, to express my gratitude to the creators of the different platforms, without which much of our work would have been taken much longer. These 5 platforms are, of course, Web Deleuze, created by Pinnas, with Deleuze's support. The Bibliothèque Nationale Française, the location for the audio tapes, donated by Deleuze's student Hidenobu Suzuki. The La Voix de Deleuze site, developed at Paris 8 Vincent Saint-Denis, based on the BNF site. The SoundCloud site, established by Mark Haas, this is the recordings. And Le Terrier, a multimedia site providing a small but important set of Deleuze transcripts. To outline the very real material discursive elements of this project through the various anomalies that we've encountered from seminar to seminar, that is, the devil in the transcripts, let me first delineate 2 types of seminars we encountered. First, the set of transcripts without supporting recordings, in contrast to the second group, those that are most complete because of the work of Hidenobu Suzuki between 79 and 87. The first type of seminar includes those that have been transcribed mainly by unknown hands, but for which we have no recordings to verify the veracity. These transcripts are all the early ones prior to 79-80, so you see the list here. 71 through 74, we have 17 sessions. There's none for 74-75. We have the RAI 3 videos, which I'll discuss in a second. And then there are 5 recordings for 76 to 79. And I recognize too late that there are 4 more sessions should be added here. The Kant sessions from 1978. And that brings this total to 36. An initial anomaly that I encountered in these texts was an effect that I term a kind of textual porosis, namely the disappearance of portions of transcribed text as if eaten from within. In this case, the Deleuze, eaten from within Deleuze, Web Deleuze. That is, random segments within previously complete transcriptions simply disappeared from various Web Deleuze texts, fortunately preserved at the platform named Le Terrier. Finding the versions of the same text on 2 different sites in 2 entirely opposite states of completion was enough of a shock, but when I turned to the translation, I was treated to yet another surprise. On the Web Deleuze site, the translation of the truncated transcribed text was completed by someone named Daniel W. Smith, and his translation faithfully renders the complete transcript, that is, without the porosis. This means that somehow, at some unspecified point, the textual porosis inexplicably struck this French transcription and others on Web Deleuze, creating unexplained gaps throughout previously complete transcripts, whereas the translations still present the full text. Fortunately, the complete transcript from Le Terrier site now can be retrieved at the Deleuze Seminars as well as Dan's translation. I earlier mentioned the exception to the unrecorded 70 sessions, which is located in the RAI3 videos available on YouTube, produced during the seminar in 75-76. These were filmed by one of Deleuze's students, Marielle Burkhalter, as part of her master's project, Filming Philosophy as It Happens, then broadcast on the RAI3 cinema program Fuori Orario. And as you will see upon accessing these on our site or directly on YouTube, each video has Italian subtitles, and the challenges for us were not simply in preparing the transcription and translation. We had to determine the chronological order of these successive seminars, and without any evident time markers, we could do so only based on the content provided in the videos. Fortunately, the initial guide for this determination was through Deleuze's course organization that followed successive plateaus from 1,000 plateaus, as well as the physical disposition of the classroom details. We then identified the chronologically first video as the one titled Deleuze su multiplicità molare e multiplicità molecolare, and we then concluded that what had appeared to be 3 sessions were in fact various segments of 6 or 7 sessions. Furthermore, while none of these sessions contained precise dates, we were able to extrapolate a sequence of dates before and after session 7 based on comments by an Iranian student speaking during that session when he announced that a demonstration would occur later that day on February 3rd, 1976. An additional complication regarding the RAI3 recordings arose quite recently when we found on YouTube 5 recordings dated between November 18th and December 16th, 75, dates that we do not have on our site, with English subtitles. A quick review revealed that these are not previously undiscovered sessions. Rather, an entrepreneur named Catrini Appelli divided up the 5 segments of the first 4-hour Il Senso in Meno recording and posted them individually with dates 1 week apart, while adding new subtitles from translations developed, wait for it, on the Deleuze Seminars site, duly attributed on each page. Besides the somewhat random dating that does not coincide with our own, the 3rd and 4th of these not new recordings, while given separate dates by Catrini Appelli, are visibly from the same session. And I mention these anomalies to indicate how the passional movement and extension might indeed operate, but also the confusion that it can entail. This review brings me to the second type of seminar, the one recorded starting on 6 November 1979 by Hidenobu Suzuki, who unfailingly sat close to Deleuze throughout the rest of his career, first at Vincennes and then at the Saint-Denis campus. Seated amidst this array of tape recorders, as you see in this first image, and within the always crowded classroom. To pursue my aphorism about the devil in the transcripts, one fundamental challenge facing any transcriber in preparing Deleuze's oral presentation is that of discerning Deleuze's inflections, emphasis, and rhythm in order then to determine paragraph breaks within the oral speech. Each transcript, whether at Web Deleuze, Paris 8, or the Deleuze Seminars, will offer different interpretations of these specific elements, hence often providing a different reading based on the transcriber's sense of Deleuze's speech patterns. As regards Paris 8, La Voix de Deleuze, that site specifically, the additional challenges underlie the transcriptions of successive segments in each seminar. With the exception of the Foucault seminar that Dan mentioned, some of the transcriptions in the sessions served especially for non-native French speakers as something of a language exercise for credit, a fact that Dan recently confirmed in discussion with an American transcriber at Paris 8 then, now a philosophy professor in the US. Dan also mentioned a detail that created additional challenges, the fact that the transcribed segments correspond to 189 different named transcribers, as well as another 20 or so unnamed. As a result, this transcription mosh pit creates an enormous diversity of outcomes for these seminars, and thus each session necessitated careful review. Added to this were inconsistencies at Paris 8 for uploading the transcribed segments, and the transpositions that sometimes occurred create a total disconnection between audio and transcription. The one exception, of course, is the Foucault seminars, thanks to the work by Annabelle Dufourc, supported by Purdue. However, another altogether different challenge occurred in my experience with the transcripts, something I have called transcript blight, with varying manifestations of this affliction. One such result in this case is that transcribers simply elided all students' interventions, possibly since they were seen as interruptions to Deleuze's flow. Another form of transcript blight became evident with the 1980 Leibniz sessions. When I started to translate these sessions in the late 1990s for Web Deleuze, I blithely assumed that the transcripts available corresponded faithfully to what Deleuze presented in the seminar. However, when I later uploaded these translations to the Deleuze Seminars site in 2020, I became aware that these sessions and others had been the object of inexplicable omissions in relation to the recordings, and that these gaps, of course, required completion, that is, new transcriptions followed by new translations. Another example of this sort of transcript blight is the strange case of the recording for Leibniz and the Baroque, Session 4. While the Web Deleuze YouTube link to the recording bears the date of 25 November 1986, Deleuze himself indicates that this session occurs on the last Tuesday before Christmas break, hence 16 December of that year. You might wonder why we cannot solve this dilemma by verifying this with the mothership, that is, with the recording at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Alas, this recourse is impossible since the session is omitted entirely from the BN list for the Leibniz and the Baroque seminar, creating a jump in the BN archive from 18 November to 6 January 1987. This gap seems to mean that Suzuki missed the December 16 session, with the recording coming from a different source. But as for the transcript of the session itself, the session's recording attributed to Web Deleuze, the recording itself omits approximately 8 paragraphs of material, while the transcription of the same session furnished at Web Deleuze somehow contains the omitted text. One other omission that I should mention occurs on Web Deleuze, this time in the 1000 Plateaus 5 seminar. The transcription for Session 7, that is January 29th, 1980, is also the same transcript available for the preceding Session 6, January 22nd. Hence, Session 6 is missing from Web Deleuze, and given that the Wada Deleuze site does not provide any transcripts for the 7980 seminar, our site now is the only location where this Session 6 is available. Now, having reached this point, I'm aware that some of this exposition may appear to be Charlie's to-do list from 2021 to the present. And if so, I'm fine with that, because one aspect of archive building is the material groundwork that must be completed in detail to establish the archive adequately and consistently. However, what the terms adequately and consistently mean will certainly vary from one archive to another, since through the development of each archive, particular characteristics and requirements emerge that are truly distinct for the given data set. I confess that I am most comfortable with the nitty-gritty details of building this archive, and Dan can certainly attest both to my consternation and delight when I discovered and could document yet another anomaly that we could remedy and set right on our site. Just in the past month or so, while following some leads on a related project, I came upon the treasure trove of documents at the Paris 8 Octaviana archive, which allows us to confirm dates and names of speakers in Deleuze's seminars and even to add his titles for these. This archival affect, that is, this sense of consternation and delight, lead me to the bigger picture, the rationale for the site we have built. The first explanation of this rationale is to provide resources for the community of Deleuze scholars, for those who do not have the time or inclination to listen to the audio recordings, might want to download them or read them on the site. And of course, with the translations into English, these resources offer access to those who otherwise would have none, and for whom we can also offer the conceptual and sociocultural context for the topics treated. I consider this first rationale as the one that best addresses the passional regime of signs, to which I referred earlier in my remarks, and this rationale extends to our attempts at data rescue. But a second rationale can be linked to the circumstances that dictated the development of the different online platforms in the first place. As Deleuze scholars may be aware, Deleuze forbade the print publication of these sessions while permitting their reproduction in digital format. Yeah, thank you for another class. This apparent contradiction can be explained, if not entirely justified, by Deleuze's friendship with Richard Pinhas, who insistently schooled Deleuze in numerous aspects of digital technology. So with Deleuze's support and the family's permission following Deleuze's death in 1995, first Pinhas, then the Bibliothèque Nationale, then Paris 8 site, then Le Terrier, and then our site have managed to bring forth these documents and render them accessible in various ways. Hence, the second rationale is that of following what might be understood as a digital imperative, or at least initiative, in contrast to the aversion to print publication of these same documents. For the Deleuze Seminars, this initiative or imperative has led me towards something of an ethos in terms of how the transcripts are to be rendered, that is, those based on verifiable recordings, and then how the translations would be developed subsequently. This ethos can be described in terms familiar to us all, not to be unworthy of our events, or perhaps more materially and clearly expressed, to be worthy of our transcripts. Of course, I understand this statement to connect to, in our context, first with the necessity of ascertaining that the fidelity of the transcriptions will provide readers with a text as close as possible to the audio recordings, and then with a translation that can explicitly follow this faithful rendering. In other words, this approach does not allow for arbitrary omissions or elisions, even when inclusion of certain passages or segments may indeed divert the session's presentation from a clear, precise course. Here, I do recognize that my approach tends towards the paranoid regime of sign stratification, but I also recognize that not every grunt or uttered by Deleuze needs to be preserved for posterity. So I believe that in the end product of relative clarity and complete fidelity supports the goals corresponding to this rationale. Of course, over the past 15 years, we have witnessed inconsistencies regarding the dictates of the Deleuzean exclusion of seminars from print. These dictates seem to have been most rigorous regarding any French language publication, but they are apparently either inapplicable or just ineffectual when faced with other languages. I refer, of course, to the proliferation of the Spanish language translations of the Deleuze Seminars published in Buenos Aires and of the Italian language translations published in Verona. The number of Italian texts is limited to the Spinoza Seminar in 1 volume and the Foucault Seminar published in 3 parts. Meanwhile, the Argentinian translations are quite abundant, 13 volumes in all, starting with the outline of Deleuze's 5960 course on Rousseau, as well as the 1978 Kant Seminar, then going to the 7980 Seminar on 1,000 Plateaus in 2 volumes, as well as the Spinoza and the Painting Seminars. Then all 4 volumes are the Cinema Seminars, consisting of nearly 3,000 pages of translated text. And then the Foucault Seminar appearing in 3 volumes, and both the 1980 and 86-87 Leibniz Seminar published in 1 volume. The Spanish title of this Leibniz seminar, Exasperación de la Filosofía, amuses me in this context because when we arrived at 2023, this proved to be indeed a year of exasperation. First, in 2023, we almost lost the Deleuze Seminar site due to computer programming issues, fortunately rectified with an additional NEH grant. And this source of support implicitly points to the importance of finding a committed funding partner, and Dan is responsible for the exhausting and successful efforts at grant procurement over the past decade. But second, in 2023, the very rationale for our project seemed to be put into question, and by this I refer to the publication of the edited French transcript of the Painting Seminar as Sur la Peinture. That is, the Deleuzean dictates that have now been modified, according to the volume's editor, David Lapoujade, since what he and the family deemed to be uncontrollable publication of traductions sauvages, or wild translations, have now made it advisable to publish the Painting Seminars transcription. Moreover, the new approach in this edition, according to Lapoujade, is to avoid what he calls two pitfalls. On one hand, to avoid reproducing the faithful oral dimension of the seminars, given that such speech is freely available online in recordings. On the other hand, to avoid reducing the oral dimension entirely. The solution is, quote, to preserve the oral aspect whenever it does not hinder reading, thus to propose a written form which retains the inflections of the spoken word, as Deleuze did when he composed the interviews that he granted. While these statements, as well as the volume itself, required a few weeks for reflection, I was fortunate in this regard because my reflection was aided greatly by taking on the task for the University of Minnesota Press of translating Sur la Peinture with contributions from the Deleuze Seminars Translation Collective. And this process allowed me to climb up inside the revisions in the new volume from Minuit, and as a result, and in discussion with Dan, we realized that nothing has changed in the least for our project at the Deleuze Seminars. Certainly, the edition prepared as Sur la Peinture does indeed revise the audio transcriptions in new, clearer texts, but in doing so, it constitutes a specific exercise of archive madness, leaning perhaps toward the paranoid pole, namely by fashioning Deleuze's enunciation in the classroom, sometimes halting, sometimes digressive, sometimes repetitive, into clarified and unhesitant formulations of his experiments in thinking. Hence, our rationale stands firmly in place, that is, to provide the imperfect and searching transcriptions as well as the translations that correspond to these recordings so that the resources are expanded. That is, while Sur la Peinture offers one accessible perspective and interpretation in print, our transcripts and translations, also in print in their own way, correspond to the extent possible to the recordings. Alongside these texts are also the full documentation of these so-called raw transcripts and additional resources of indexing, that is, retrieval elements that through key names and key topics. And to this we are adding brief biographical notes for each of the key names so readers can find guidance when encountering Deleuze's extensive references. Furthermore, this process has helped me grasp the importance of the seminars as successive steps of lab experiments, possibly yielding completed publications, as Dan has mentioned, but which take an entirely different form in the live setting. Hence, the 8 painting sessions were developed in all likelihood for the Bacon book, but ultimately they are entirely distinct from this text. The same can be said for the 4 seminars on cinema in relation to the 2 cinema books, as well as the 26 sessions on Foucault for the slim Foucault volume, as well as the 20 sessions on Leibniz and the Baroque for the Fold. While the seminar's status might appear settled into place in light of the published works, the recent discovery I mentioned of the Octaviana archive and the October 2024, that is, forthcoming publication of the Spinoza Seminars by Minuit, indicate that no, nothing is settled, there is more to be done and understood for intelligence to emerge, that the archive madness never stops, that our continued engagement with these documents assures that the circular process can and does continue and will also continue to provide ever keener insights on Deleuze's processes of thinking and creating and, of course, becoming. Thank you very much.
Token question, as we said, right? Yes.
5
so
minutes.
One token question. Who is going to be the lucky winner? No one? One.
I'm not sure it's going to be a question. I feel it's a bit more like at a wedding where you get to do the vote of thanks. So I think perhaps on behalf of everyone here, we would like to acknowledge the tremendous work that you're doing, and I hope that you get a rich donor from Silicon Valley to fund you into the next century. If there is one question here, it'll be, of course, but what about Guattari, whose archive is probably in just as parlous a state, given that he gave seminars, etc., everywhere. So I'm not trying to multiply your problem, but certainly I did want to say you guys have done a tremendous job and we all owe you a debt of thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Thank you.